once we were in this dugout canoe, and we were like these rivers, they go like this, and you have to go under trees, and and at one stage there's this tree that had fallen over that river, and we come along this bend in the river, and we see that tree over that tiny river, and there's this chimp crossing that tree. And while we are arriving, the chimp sees us, but the tree was not that big, so it was a little bit unstable. So the chimp really didn't know what to do. Like going back, he had to sort of turn back on that branch, and he was too scared to fall in the water. And then he knew that if he would advance on that tree, he would be right there in the middle of that river when we would arrive. So he was sort of frozen there on that tree, and that tree was like, I mean, half a meter above us. So when we then sort of floated under that chimp, so we were like, we could touch it. We could touch each other, and we were like, and you could see him in his eyes, like, ah. And then we sort of floated under the chimp, and it was like,
Everyone,
wow.
backgrounds, all ages, all
It is
genders, and
my
all walks of life
distinct
deserve an
pleasure
education.
today to
Come be
welcome
one
in
of
Boss, who is from the World Wildlife Fund, the WWF, and he is the African Species Director, which is going to tell us all about what that means and how he got into conservation of not just the elephants and gorillas, but also my favorite animal of all time, the rhino. Boss, welcome on in. How are you doing today?
Well, thanks for having me. This is really cool to be on a cool thing like yours. I mean, I've watched one of yours with all those emojis. I'm like, oh man, I'm old.
We've been having a blast chatting with some of your colleagues again in conservation, ranging from pollinators to black-footed ferrets and prairie dogs and ecosystems and the climate change difficulty. Uh, we're very excited to talk to you. The African animals are just something very catching of an imagination, I believe, right? With when it comes to animals from Africa. How did you get involved in conservation of African animals? What does your day-to-day look like? Tell us your story.
All right. Well, basically, I've always been fascinated by like wilderness and like roaming around like intact forests. That was always my thing. And then when I was a young kid at primary school, there was this National Geographic magazine about the Congo Basin. And from that moment onwards, I was like, oh, tropical forest with those huge trees. And in those forests, you have like big animals like forest elephants and forest buffalo and great apes. So from that moment, I knew I wanted to work in the Congo Basin. And yeah, I studied geography, and so human geography, which was like a sort of a detour to get into conservation. But yeah, as we all know, conservation is more a human-induced issue than it's a wildlife expert issue. So actually, it was a good fit, and I was lucky enough to end up in the Congo Basin at one stage, and in a job which was not really a conservation job. But then I met this Belgian guy in Gabon when I was working there, and he just started a project for World Wildlife Fund at the request of the Gabonese government to create in this huge forest block, which is called the Minkebe Forest, to identify the potential of creating a protected area there. And I said, well, when I'm done with this job, I'm going to work for you as a volunteer. And that's where that was in 97. So I stayed in Gabon for 15 years and stayed in that region a couple more years. Yeah. So that's how it sort of started.
Did you have, when you originally started, studying the human geography element to it, did you foresee yourself staying in Gabon or anywhere like in Africa for the next 15 years? Like that's showing like you really fell in love with the area, right?
Well, it is true that the moment I decided to jump on that plane for that first job, which is only a 2-year job, I packed basically everything I loved, knowing that, I mean, I'm not going to put anything in storage with I love because I'm going to stay there for a time. And it was actually my American wife that who I met in Gabon, who sort of hijacked me to the US. Otherwise, I would still have been there, I'm sure.
So, what
Yeah.
was the original project like that you got involved in? How did that relate to conservation of animals? And one particular thing that you pointed out that I think maybe most of us didn't know before this interview started is that it's not just about wildlife conservation, right? It's not just this wildlife expert going in to help save this animal. It's very much this interaction with the local people in the area, getting community buy-in, balancing their economic needs against the survival of the animal. How does all that come into play, especially with that first
Yeah.
project and then dealing with, subsequent animals as well?
Yeah, no, exactly. Doing conservation on the ground, you really need to be a sort of a jack of all trades. You can bring in experts for particular issues like monitoring of a particular species or research, but to be on the ground and do protected area management or protected area creation or corridor restoration, that kind of stuff, you really need to work with all the stakeholders that have user rights in those areas. This is areas that belong to people. There is always a myth that in remote places, beautiful place in the world, it's just wilderness and it's just empty land. That does not exist. Um, so in that very first project, that Minke Bay project, that is sort of an exception almost. There was like 20,000 square kilometers. Well, maybe for American audiences, it's like, oh, it's a bit less miles, but I'm from the Netherlands, so it's half of my country, that area. There was no roads, no villages, but still, there was illegal gold miners. There were indigenous people in the fridges. So the first job really was to go in that forest and sort of map initial things like vegetation types and sort of presence of large mammals. And in that case, it was forest elephants and great apes.
What what
You couldn't
does
really
what
cut.
does mapping
Yeah.
entail? So if you're told to go into this, I love how you're painting this picture for us of this relatively large land area, right? Nothing official in terms of civilization, but some native peoples and illegal people coming in, right, for the gold mines. What does that mean like when you're starting to map to outline what's living there? What do you have to do? What were the methodologies that you had to do?
Yeah, so in that case, since it was such a vast area and so inaccessible, what we did was called sort of reconnaissance surveys. So reconnaissance surveys is basically a very um, uh, not very scientific method of having an impression of like abundance of the species that you try to sort of map out. So you basically walk a line along a path. Well, there's no path there, but you go from point A to B that you map on a map, and then you walk, let's say, a path of least resistance. So you try to walk as straight as you possibly can, but without knowing the landscape. So you bump into rivers, etc., that you try to cross, and mountains, but you still try to go straight. And along that sort of transect, um, you then count, let's say, sign of the animals that you try to count at a certain distance of that line. So for elephants, for instance, you don't see them because you make way too much noise by stamping through that forest. So you count their dung, and for great apes, you count their nests. And then you also have, let's say, a sort of decay rate of dung and of nests. So you also map, let's say, the age of the dung you find or the age of the nests you see, to sort of calibrate, let's say, and you know how many dung piles an elephant sort of poops a day. So yeah, so there is this sort of like calculation that you do in terms of, let's say, yeah, how many dung you see, how many elephants that sort of presents, and you sort of extrapolate that to that larger area. So yeah, in that case, it was like more than a year of walking, more than 1,000 kilometers with people through different transects in that forest. Yeah, and we came up with astonishing numbers of elephants and astonishing few numbers of great apes, particularly gorillas. So those elephant numbers have dropped significantly since then because of that elephant poaching crisis that we went through in the meantime. And we later discovered that those low densities in that area of great apes, who definitely were not hunted, it was so inaccessible, was due to an Ebola outbreak that had wiped out about 95% of the great ape populations in that area. So that is basically how you sort of like count, like do a first sort of general sweep of a remote forest area like that.
How many transects did you have to do? Like for that plot of land, how many times did you have to walk across in that straight line to be satisfied that you have the right kind of image almost of what's living there?
Well, it is really sort of quasi-scientific. So you also look at that area based on where you actually can even reach. So you try to sample from each angle where you can get in. And the furthest we could go in was like following rivers, so using dugout canoes, and that's where you can really go deep into the forest, or from nearest roads. So yeah, we sampled, we did 4 different sort of expeditions of about 2 months each. And that still was like a tiny fragment of that huge forest. So
So,
I think we walked about 900 kilometers of line transects to come up with a sort of overall general estimate of apes and elephants at that time.
and it was 2 months per one of those expeditions.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. In doing this expedition, like for each time, did you ever come across animals that maybe you weren't expecting, or even the gold miners that are there illegally, and how did you deal with that kind of encounter? Because right, I'm imagining that you're going from studying human geography, and now I'm just gonna be like, all right, boss, I'm gonna just drop you in this forest.
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah. Now that
Like,
is, I mean, I was definitely still quite young, and I was not a trained wildlife biologist. So the first time I went to that forest, it was like a Gabonese colleague who even had to teach me like the basics of like a GPS and how to use, because we didn't have much. We had a GPS, we had old French army maps of the 70s that we had sort of glued together in big maps. And we had a compass. And then we had sort of calculated, let's say, what is the type of food that we can all carry that can last us as long as possible. Um, so yeah, you just learn it by doing, really. Uh, yeah,
it's just really, it's so cool to hear as how you're talking about this, because it's kind of intimidating, right? It's gonna be like pretty
oh
much
gosh,
here.
yeah. No,
We
it
do
is
this all the
really
time. You'll be
intimidating.
fine. You'll be fine. It's like, what? And then it's 2 month
No, I
expedition.
mean, if you would do that nowadays, people would definitely. I mean, we had no satellite phone, so like the furthest point, so it was like, I don't know, like 200 kilometers from the nearest road, without any. There's no footpath, anything. So and you have to go through swamps, and so if some of us would have had a appendicitis or a broken leg. But
You
yeah, so unexpected things that we saw,
Yeah.
things like well, one of the most beautiful antelopes in the world is called the Bongo antelope. So it's a forest antelope. It's like a sort of a Sitatunga kind, but then even more majestic and a bit bigger, and this beautiful like chestnut brown with these white stripes and black stripes and these beautiful horns. And in that forest, a thing we also didn't know because we had never done flight overs or you have these Inselbergs, and those Inselbergs are the sort of granite rocky outcrops that sort of out of nowhere just come out of that forest canopy and just stick above those 40, 50-meter high trees. So you have like this, like, yeah, you come out of the forest. So we were like, the first time we came to one of those mountains, nobody had ever seen those mountains. None of our teams, we had never heard of it. All this local population around that forest didn't know about them. And so we got completely excited and we started to climb up and then and it's sort of it's like rocky. So there's also no trees. There's a sort of grass growing on it and there's a few wet patches. And on top of one of that first one we climbed, there was this bongo antelope. There was this three bongo antelope who had never seen humans either. So they were not afraid of us. So I had this camera. I remember I had this camera, and I looked after it on that film. I was sort of like, as a small kid, hopping behind it. Oh, this is a bongo. This is a bongo. This bongo sort of like hopping away from me and stopping again. Yeah, but there was many of those unexpected or really amazing encounters during those months.
It sounds like one of those encounters that would just be like a life-changing one, right? Where it's like a big adventure. You're this pioneer in this
Oh
world that
gosh.
people haven't seen ever before. Do you have from that experience, before we get into like what the actionable items were that you were, able to do at Institute, just from the exploration side of things, do you have a favorite memory that you look back on that you remember very fondly?
Well, I definitely in terms of, let's say, the teamwork. So you are with 5 people and you fully depend on each other during those 5 months, and you eat the same food every day for 5 months, and you carry that food and just get through that. Uh, and every night you make a new camp, and so you know each other so well. So that is just sort of that kind of thing from people from all types of life and from different cultures. That, but also just indeed, I mean, that Zen thing that you just walk with your backpack every day. Also that, but then in terms of wildlife encounters, there are so many nice ones. But like to give you an example was once we were in this dugout canoe, and we were like these rivers, they go like this, and you have to go under trees, and and, and at one stage there's this tree that had fallen over that river, and we come along this bend in the river, and we see that tree over that tiny river, and there's this chimp crossing that tree. And while we are arriving, the chimp sees us, but the tree was not that big, so it was a little bit unstable. So the chimp really didn't know what to do. Like going back, he had to sort of turn back on that branch, and he was too scared to fall in the water. And then he knew that if he would advance on that tree, he would be right there in the middle of that river when we would arrive. So he was sort of frozen there on that tree, and that tree was like, I mean, half a meter above us. So when we then sort of floated under that chimp, so we were like, we could touch it. We could touch each other, and we were like, you could see him in his eyes, like, ah. Oh. And then we sort of floated under the chimp, and it was like, wow. Yeah, beautiful.
That's so cool. I just pause as an aside. I love how when you're telling us this story, your eyes are just lighting up, and you can tell how much that you love doing this, and it just really just humanizes the experience to it. Everyone in the chat is too, like, oh, this is absolutely just amazing. So you've gone through this area, right? You've done the multiple 2-month journeys to survey the land. What does what with the information that you've gotten now? You were telling us that there was more elephants than expected, less great apes than expected due to the outbreak in Ebola. I
Yeah.
guess 2 questions from that is, one, I'm just out of curiosity, how did you know to attribute the lack of the gorillas due to Ebola? Number one, and then number two, the bigger picture question is, what do you do with this information in terms of like this is this is the land outline, this is what I've got for the densities. What does one then do with that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good example of how, let's say, imperfect conservation sometimes is. So how, let's say, land use allocations for a national park actually happen in real life. It's in the past, and even nowadays. Well, nowadays there's fewer and fewer opportunities to set aside land for, let's say, strong protection status like a national park. But even back then, it was really like, yeah, you base it on very few information, but you also base it on, does it impede on human development of people? Does it impede on somebody else's land? Which in that case wasn't the case. So we had a very strong case in terms of its intact forest. Has never been logged. There is no current land claims or of anybody on that land. It's not being used by local communities apart from time to time indigenous Baka pygmies, but they only go that far in the forest only for elephant poaching, so they don't go for other things in there. And we had a strong case about, let's say, it was really one of the last strongholds of forest elephants. We estimated about 20,000 elephants in that huge forest. So then basically looking at that huge forest block, see where villages are, roads are, potential future pressures, sort of a, I mean, it's a bit more nuanced than that, but sort of a blob in the middle. Ta-da. And yeah, that takes 10 years to get it gazetted as a national park, but that's sort of like where it starts. And then in terms of, let's say, that Ebola outbreak, there had been in the fringes of that forest block, there had been previous small studies on great apes. So there had been like more scientific, so line transects, so not those reconnaissance walks that we did, but really where you can estimate densities, transects done in the fringes of that forest. And that really showed like really high densities, especially for gorillas, because it was also like good habitat for lowland gorillas. And when we came back to those same areas, there was nothing. So that was one thing, but at the same time, there had been 2 Ebola outbreaks amongst humans in that area since those surveys were done and since we passed. And Ebola passes amongst between apes, so between us and apes. And that happens basically when people hunt for great apes. It is the hunters then that get infected, because you get infected. Ebola is transmitted by body fluids, sort of like blood, and that's how those hunters then infected their communities. So yeah, putting those 2 things together, it was just impossible for those gorillas to be gone, and it was impossible for that whole intact forest with perfect grade 8 habitat, especially gorilla habitat, to be empty, completely empty, without any possibility of poaching, because there was no sign of any poaching, no human presence sign in that intact piece of that forest block.
So it very much comes back to this jack of many trades. You're almost a detective, right? And you're piecing together the puzzles of what you're saying. Like you said, ruled out the possibility of poaching, ecosystem looks good, therefore it's this other factor that we were able to identify. In instances like that, where you've got this perfect land area for great apes, would you ever come up with the possibility of bringing in populations that are maybe displaced into this area because the population collapsed? Or is it something where, because of the complexity of apes, you wouldn't ever bring in new colonies or new groups of cohorts to live in this area?
Yeah, with great apes it's particularly difficult, but in that case the populations were very low, but they were still present. So indeed, when you have present populations, it's just you just count on population recovery, which takes a very long time. But translocations happen a lot. for many species, like for rhinos, for instance. That's a very common practice. To a lesser extent, but that also happens for savanna elephants on the African continent. But for great apes, no, that's and in this case, it was also not even an option, because you still had remnant populations that could at least expand, not recover to the full densities probably that there were before Ebola. But yeah.
So for these populations in that whole area, was the end story that you did in fact were able to make it into a national park? And was it like a positive success story at the end?
Oh no, it's a huge success story. I mean, it was first gazetted as a, well, what they called it, like in their in the Gabonese law, like it was a faunal reserve, about 6,000 square kilometers. So that's huge. Eh? That's a huge piece of land. And then I think in 2012, Gabon declared in one go 13 national parks. So that Minkebe Reserve was then also transformed into a national park. Yeah, and
Is
national
that
park status
is that critical because of the protections that come along with it? So for just being protective land to national park, like how you the legalese behind it of what protections that land and the animals on it get?
yeah. So in each country there has its legislation around, let's say, different categories of protected areas, and in general, a national park is the strongest status, where basically no extractive activities or permanent human settlements can take place. And it's also always, let's say, the crown jewel of a protected area estate of a country that are put into a national park status, like the Yellowstones. And yeah, that's really the pride of your country, is you put that into a national park sort of status, with
Nice.
also like a connotation of potentially valorizing it for tourism purposes, if that option exists.
Are there any active surveys that also take place on this land? So like after you had done your initial survey and you'd had it chalked up, like here's the elephants that live here, here are the great apes, here's the dynamics of the zone. Are there active going back into that zone and monitor those populations to make sure, like you said, that they're staying healthy, if stuff needs to be changed, if people are coming in? How does that follow-up step work?
Yes. No, what I'm describing is just indeed that there's initial phases of identifying the potential of if and where a protected area could be put in a place like that. But then you have to indeed set up all the management structures for an area like that. So in that particular place at that time, the few stresses were illegal gold mining. So let's say small scale alluvial gold miners that came into that area and were feeding themselves by eating bushmeat. But yeah, some of those camps, the biggest was at that moment was like 1,500 people. So that's a lot of people to eat bushmeat every day. So that was a stressor. And then elephant poaching was at that moment starting to increase. And elephant poaching is something for which you don't need to carry fresh meat out of the forest, so you're not really limited in distance. So elephant poaching can take place even on foot, on long distances. So we need to set up like an infrastructure and a management framework that could, let's say, address a couple of these threats. So yeah, you have to work with those gold miners. You have to, in some cases, they were even, in some places, they were even evacuated from the area. Most of those gold miners were also not even from Gabon itself, but from neighboring countries. And so yeah, you set up, let's say, surveillance control posts along access roads or rivers. Yeah, you have to recruit rangers, set up headquarters. All logging companies started to arrive in the periphery, so you have to work with those logging companies. at that time, and in some cases it still happens, that logging companies also pay their staff really badly. So they just close their eyes so that for those workers to also be able to hunt after working hours, so that they feed themselves from the forest. So we had to work with those logging companies to set up very strict, let's say, anti eating wild meat policies, providing alternative protein for their workers. Yeah, so indeed the whole management regime needs to be set up. You need to set up a management plan, financial plan. Yeah.
So, Boz, it went from like a magical journey, right, through this incredible land to now a logistical nightmare is what it sounds like, right? Like you're saying, like not only do you have to deal with the people who are already on that land who shouldn't be there, right? But then the logging companies coming in, flanking all over the place of the land as well. I think one very hard question comes up is, right, I think you and I would agree that poaching and taking out these elephants is morally wrong. And you could also pass laws that say that this is wrong. But what is the line of enforcement when you're trying to stop this poaching, right? Like where it for you and other scientists in the field, where's that ethical line between enforcing that you shouldn't be poaching, the difference between enforcing versus having the military come in? Can you barter it away that, here is an alternative for you so you don't have to do poaching? Like, where in this ethical like
Yeah.
spider web do you even start in dealing with that particular part of it?
Yeah, no, that's a good question and a difficult one, and that's very context specific. So if we still stay on, let's say that Congo Basin region, so that's all tropical forest, very low human population densities in those rural areas, and they all traditionally live off the land. So they are hunters and gatherers, a little bit of agriculture, but so they live from fishing and from eating wild meat. If you let those people just do their thing, um, that has a very limited impact in some of those remote regions on total wildlife populations, because they will not go that far in the forest to find sufficient meat to feed their families. The problem starts with, let's say, the bushmeat part of poaching is when remote urban populations, like in the capital cities, they still have that preference for wild meat over domesticated meat, and you start to get like this commercial bushmeat trade, where huge quantities are being transported by logging trucks, by trains, or other means of, let's say, transport over hundreds of kilometers away from that forest. And then you start to get a whole different type of actors getting involved in that bushmeat trade. It's not your local farmer that goes once a week to hunt an antelope, but then you have people that are completely specialized in that trade. And in some instances, we have seen even in that area that you had people that, okay, so you have like the people that organize the hunters, then you have like a first base camp, where the hunters that have the snare lines, where they like, no, so the porter goes in, that's where they rest. So they walk like 50 kilometers in the forest, and then they have rest for a night. And then you have satellite base camps. And from those satellite base camps, you have hunters who are sort of quasi permanently in the forest, and each have, let's say, kilometers long trap lines of snares. And they walk their snare lines every day, and they drop that meat in those satellite camps. And then you have special porters that do nothing else but every day carrying wild meat to the base camp, and from the base camp other porters. So that's a huge industry. So that is the kind of thing you need to address and really sort of criminalize, while at the same time setting up systems that subsistence hunting should be allowed, and where possible regulated. That's for the bushmeat issue, which is a very complex issue. But then you have things like elephant ivory or rhino horn. like this fully protected species, or leopard skins, leopard claws and teeth, and these kind of pangolin scales, which are only really hunted for, let's say, remote markets, mostly in Asia at this stage. Um, and that is a different thing. Those are people that are completely specialized in killing animals for body parts. And yeah, that should definitely that is something that you need to treat really with increasing penalties, uh, with sort of a whole of government combating wildlife crime approach. Yeah.
That seems like again an extremely difficult scenario to play out. Like I think all of these interviews that we've had so far, that's kind of been the common theme is that you can't just go in and be like, we're gonna take care of this animal. There's all this nuance to it, dealing with the people who are living in that area. Like you said, it's there's the families that just need food and they're just getting food for their own families versus the gigantic empire, right, of building and getting bushmeat versus taking on an animal just for one part of its body and just leaving everything else behind. Like it's a gigantic puzzle that you're dealing with, boss. Again, what do you think is the hardest part of, I guess, navigating that of like you're trying to get people on side to ensure that, this land that I'm protecting, whether it be this original one that you started your work on or a different land, what is the hardest part? And I guess how do you overcome that in terms of getting folks on side?
Well, like in Southern Africa, they have this saying, which is like, if it pays, it stays. So it's a very Southern Africa model, and it's not applicable in many contexts. But the general thinking behind this, it hits the mark. If you impose like restrictions on an area without giving other stakeholders the tangible benefits of locking that area up. Those areas are in general, the reason why those areas are still so full of wildlife is that they are very remote. Otherwise, they would already have been completely degraded and hunted out. So being remote also means that the people living in those areas are also in general quite marginalized and poor. So if you don't provide those people with either benefits directly linked to that protected area status, either by employing them directly as rangers or as guides or as porters or all the types of jobs that you can create in conservation, or in the lucky circumstances where you can actually develop nature-based tourism opportunities. If you have none of that, you have a problem. You will start to get like these fortress conservation models where you basically fight against forces you can't win, and you shouldn't try to win, because then that's not working.
So what was I guess the next project that you had? And I know that there's going to be a transition at some point to working on rhinos as well. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the other projects that you'd helmed, and then kind of getting into the rhino conservation side of things as well? Because again, it seems like it's a different original
Yeah.
like goal from just like, here's protected land, hearing what's in there and to see if it's worth, raising up through the levels, versus here is an animal that we need to protect. Like that's a very different, I would imagine maybe it's a different approach between the two questions.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. So indeed, we have been talking a lot about that very first, let's say, 30 years ago sort of experience, and many other experiences that I sort of followed. So yeah, I've always also worked a lot when I was still based in the Congo Basin region on let's say, that was at the time when that elephant poaching crisis really started. And we wanted to get it out of, let's say, the ministries in charge of protected areas or environment, and getting it much higher on the political agenda of those countries. by advancing the argument that wildlife crime was also eroding, let's say, good governance, and was in some cases also creating these very insecure circumstances for people, because heavily armed poachers with AK-47s, even from neighboring countries, were entering remote places. And it was also bad for economical development. So that whole sort of argument needed to be built and needed to also be heard by other ministries and other actors in government. But yeah, maybe now coming to another species, rhinos. So I'm more the Africa guy, but so we can talk about, let's say that there are 5 species of rhinos, but yeah, depending on what you would like to discuss. But
So,
in
boss,
Africa,
again, I just want you, my favorite animal since I've been a kid. I
it's
like
rhino.
reading about your profile on the WDF website. I'm like, this is the guy I wanted to be when I was a kid, right? Like, this, like, dream job kind of scenario. So, please tell me all about the various. We actually were talking about a little bit earlier on the show about like there's the northern and the southern right rhino and the different conservation approaches that were attempted, right? And one
Right,
kind of being successful, the other there's only 2 of them left, aged
right.
females. The other subgroups within the continent, how do you do the protections on the different types? What are the different approaches? And of course, I have to ask if you have a favorite type of rhino too.
Yeah, that's true. And that's unfortunately not an African rhino. That's the Sumatran rhino. Sumatran rhino is like the smallest. It's also a tropical forest rhino. They also call it the singing rhino. It has this. If you everybody knows the humpback whale, sort of like wailing, sort of like this dreaming sound. Sumatran rhino does that, and it's also like it's a hairy rhino. It has this sort of like long like hair. It's a beautiful animal, which is I mean, 2 of the 5 rhino species are one of the most endangered mammals on Earth. I mean, Sumatran rhinos, nobody knows, but maybe between 30 and 50 left. Probably none of those rhinos are still in viable subpopulations. So maybe in one area there might still be enough to even find each other to mate. So that is a very dire situation. And then you have another.
They're
Uh,
solitary too, right? The Sumatran rhinos, they're usually living in by themselves. Like you said, if their
exactly.
populations are fragmented, it doesn't even matter really. There's 50 left. If they can't get together, that's that.
Yeah. That is really the key issue.
Do we know how
Um,
many there were at like the heyday? Like where did like what an estimated population before we rammed it down to 50?
uh, but they had a very wide range originally. So now it's only like in 2 islands, or one island is confirmed, and the second island in Indonesia that's a maybe. But before that, it was like in most Southeast Asian countries that rhino existed throughout those tropical forest range. So yeah, that is. I don't have the figure here, but yeah, that must have been thousands and thousands of that species for sure. Yeah.
Then to down
But
to
anyway, so
50.
that's
Yeah.
my favorite rhino. But yeah, so in Africa, 2 species of rhino: the black rhino and the white rhino. So for the white rhino, you have 2 subspecies: the northern, as you said, and the southern. And for the black rhino, you have 3 remaining subspecies. So for the white rhino, as you also just said, the northern white rhino, there's only 2 left, a mother and a daughter. They are under the 24/7 sort of like heavy protection. So that is sort of like functionally extinct species. There's only 2 left. So there's all these efforts now to sort of rebuild that subspecies because none of those 2 females can also carry babies. So they both have different issues. One has whatever, it doesn't matter. But so they have, from both females, they have managed to extract their eggs, and from the last males that when they were still alive, they collected sperm. So now the hope is that at one stage they could sort of via in vitro fertilization implant embryos of the northern right rhino in southern right rhino females. That's currently what the plan is. So yeah, WF doesn't really work on that kind of stuff. It's very sort of like high-tech veterinary kind of work. And we mostly use, let's say, our flagship species work also as a sort of an umbrella function to protect larger landscapes. So we're not very much a species-specific focus organization, although those are important, but we also use them as sort of ambassadors for ecological functions over large connected landscapes. So then you have the southern white rhino. That is a sort of a conservation success story where from a low point of, I don't know, 100 animals in one site, it's now the most populous rhino species left on Earth with, I don't know, a bit more than 15,000 today. So that is most of them are in South Africa and Namibia and Kenya and a few other countries, but those are the three most important ones. And then you have the black rhino, divided also in three subspecies. With again South Africa having the highest numbers of that species, and Namibia a close second, and then Kenya third, and there was a couple more. So conservation issues for rhinos and also between those rhino species is very different from, let's say, forest elephants, which is also very different again from savanna elephants. But yeah, for let's say black rhinos, where a lot of our work is focusing on, because it's a critically endangered species versus the white rhino, which is doing quite okay. The first threat is rhino poaching for their horn. That remains the most urgent threat we all have to deal with, and a lot of work goes into that. And unfortunately, that is where most of the attention needs to go at this stage. So a lot of effort and resources goes into this horrible thing of wildlife crime and putting criminals behind bars and getting all the specialists involved in investigations and prosecutions and trying to roll up internationally operating criminal syndicates. So stepping away from an approach from the past where you try to get the poacher towards a moralistic whole of government approach where you also involve the judiciary, the police, customs, to try to dismantle or at least take out kingpins in that trade. So that remains a key component of that work. You also try to, let's say, take away incentives to poach those rhinos for their horn. And one last resort solution that is very effective is by trimming the horn or dehorning rhino. So you don't completely dehorn them, but you take off the horn, which is basically like a fingernail, same stuff, it's keratin. So that poachers know there is nothing to get. Since rhino poaching is now in all rhino range countries punished by heavy penalties, the risk of a poacher to go after a rhino, follow a rhino trail for a day or 2 days or 3 days into, in most cases, heavily protected areas, with the chance of following a dehorned rhino, that really is working. You can really see in places where that is done, like in many places in South Africa or Namibia, that poaching levels really drop significantly following these kind of operations. Another really constraint for black rhino is in places where it's successful, like in Namibia, is a lack of habitat, lack of secure habitat. Black rhinos are also solitary animals. They They don't reproduce well in high densities. They also like start to fight, and the females reproduce less. So they do best in low densities. So finding new secure areas in their former range to reintroduce, let's say, to build new populations in new areas, that's also a very effective strategy. But as you fight this poaching surge, rhino protection is a very costly exercise. Yeah.
Can you give us,
So
boss,
those are the two critical things that, yeah.
all right, can you give us an estimate of the cost associated with something like this? Because just for like one of these sites, I'd
Yeah.
imagine the cost is pretty astronomical, right? Of like getting the government on board, getting the patrols on, getting the court system on board. Like it's, I imagine this is a huge sums that we're talking about.
Yeah, you talk about big sums, but you also talk about big areas and about important species. But yeah, so let's say, I don't know, let's say there is all these calculations of, let's say, averages of how many dollars per, let's say, square mile. But for a significant piece of land where you have a valuable species like pangolins, like rhinos, like elephants, I mean, costs are, let's say, can vary between, let's say, $1 million or several million US dollars per year to manage the site. If you then on top of that you also you have like your wildlife crime program nationally, where you also work with other law enforcement agencies and with the courts. Yeah, that's a whole different envelope as well. But just to protect your core areas, yeah, that is the kind of numbers you talk about, and that is how you can protect rhinos. Rhinos are so valuable for their horn. You can only protect them in places that are really well secured and protected by ranger forces. And in some cases, in most cases, unfortunately nowadays, even by fenced off protected areas. That's completely different again if you go for elephants, because elephants, they need huge spaces, especially in like in drier countries, like in Southern Africa. They don't stick to a protected area. They roam vast areas, and they cross lands where people live. So that's there is a whole other set of things we work on. To work with all the stakeholders that live on that land to how to create conditions for cohabitation between these type of dangerous, wide-ranging species that need that connectivity between protected areas to survive.
When you're, so you mentioned one possibility, like with the rhinos, like with the black rhino, it's a solitary animal. There's only going to be so many that are going to do well in a given space. How do you, like, let's say I've identified for you, boss, a new space,
Yeah.
and I could tell
Yes,
you,
thanks. Great.
okay, and I'm gonna give it to you for free, right? You don't have to worry about that. What do you do? Because you, here's, I'm like, my mind is already running on this. Like you said, it works best if it's already able to be protected, right? So how does one evaluate a new site that it's good enough to be able to be protected, let's say, and then how and when do you decide to bring in rhinos from
Yeah.
other locations into this given site, and how do you evaluate if that is successful? I know I just threw a lot in there, but basically it's like
No, yeah.
new site for rhino, what makes it good? How do you determine that?
Okay, so new sites for rhino. First, you have to do like studies to see if like the habitat types are appropriate for the subspecies of rhino you want to introduce, and ideally you reintroduce only rhino into areas that are within its former range, so that have been hunted out of those areas in the past. So those studies are quite detailed in terms of, I mean, people know what is the kind of species the rhinos eat. So are they there? Black rhino are, for instance, is water dependent. Is there permanent water sources? If not, do you have the means to put them in? So you first do that sort of habitat feasibility studies, and then you need to make sure that that place is really well protected before you move rhinos in. So those are the two basic conditions, and then actually moving the rhinos. That is, I mean, these people are so professional at doing that stuff. So you might have seen, like in a place like South Africa, they move them by helicopter to the nearest road. In Namibia, fortunately, there's always a way to get somewhere with a truck. But these guys are extremely professional, and they move all types of species around. So they're actually physically moving of rhino from one place to another. It's a very spectacular operation to witness, and is very successful. I mean, an example can be like in South Africa. You have this program that is run by WWF and partners. It's called the Black Rhino Range Expansion Project, which started in 2003, I believe. Let me get my notes. I have this note here. Yeah, so they have already established since then 17 new rhino populations. They translocated 280 rhinos, and already more than 200 calves have been born from those new populations. So, so rhino range expansion is a critical piece of rhino protection, because first of all, it established new populations where there were none. It creates more value to that land, because rhinos is by definition also something that attracts people in a good way, like tourists. And it also spreads your poaching risk, because if you have one site like Kruger, where in South Africa, where all those rhinos are congregated, I mean, that is where the pressure of poaching on those rhinos is just immense. So to spread that risk also by creating those new populations is also a very important tool.
You mentioned the rhino relocation is a magical event. Have you been part of one of these? And if so, could you describe to us, like, what does that look like when something like this happens? We talked about black-footed ferret releases back into the wild, where there's almost a ceremony of people, right, releasing into the wild. Is it almost like that, surreal connection to the world when you're doing some event like this?
Yeah, I actually participated in that, what was it, like 2 months ago in Namibia. So there you have Namibia is serious a success model for conservation, and in that area where I was recently, it's called the Kunene region, which is in the extreme northwestern part of Namibia. Namibia is a country on the Atlantic coast, just north of South Africa. And in that part of the country, that Kunene region, it's sort of like Mars. It's extremely dry. It's all mountains, red rocks. Nothing grows. There's no water. There's nothing. And there is the largest free-roaming black rhino population on Earth. It's in extreme low densities. It is not a protected area. It's a place as big as the Netherlands, more than 4 million hectares. So there's one rhino there, and it's just huge. It's again as big as the Netherlands, and it's not many, but because there's hardly any habitat. But those are desert adapted black rhino. So that operation I was allowed to sort of witness was also there to expand the range of those rhino to another area. So the northern Namibia, just as a bit of background, which is quite interesting. It's all communal land, so it's owned by local communities, no private land ownership, but communities decided back at independence that you have this communal approach to managing land. So this group said, well, this is our land and this is our land, and they created communal conservancies. Those communal conservancies have like the purpose of communities living, benefiting from the wildlife on their land. So they were legally allowed to have user rights of the wildlife on their land, which created huge benefits for them. And since there are also people that have cattle, before they had those user rights, and they started to eat sometimes an antelope, people said, well, you're poachers. So they said, if I'm a poacher, then I get rid of all those antelopes because they eat the grass of my cattle. Since that paradigm shift happened, wildlife populations have really reboomed in that area. So including those rhinos. So that rhino, to find rhinos on Mars, it's impossible. So what they have is like they have a fixed wing aircraft, they have 2 helicopters, and then you have ground crews. So you have permanent people, like for instance, you have in Namibia, you have an amazing organization called Save the Rhino Trust. They have these rhino trackers, community members that do nothing else but following rhinos they know and protect them that way. So these know their rhino. At least they know, well, last week they were sort of there. So then you put those helicopters in the air, you start to circulate in those mountains and then where that rhino is. The first is the fixed wing, because that can go further distances. And when it's located, then you try to see where is the nearest road, because you need to get to that rhino also afterwards with a truck. And if you find a rhino which is a rhino you would like to translocate, because you need females and males, so you need to have like at least a couple. Yeah, then you have a helicopter where you have the darter, so the person that shoots the rhino, and then you have a team with vets. And the moment that rhino is down, it's like you have one team. You have the vet that does the anesthesia. You have people that take blood samples, skin samples, all the measurements that put in. Often they put on like collars or tracking devices, either like pods that they put on the horn. They dehorn the rhino, and all that in like 20 minutes at most. And that rhino is sort of like, yeah, and then they need to put it into a truck. So yeah, to put it in the, I mean, to put it in the truck is, yeah, a rhino is a huge animal. It's like, I don't know, a black rhino is like 1,500 kilograms or something. So they make sure it is straight on its legs. Can't put it like that because then it can suffocate because of the weight on the lungs. So it puts there, and then they put this antidote in it to wake it up. But you have to make sure that rhino is really aggressive. So when it sort of like startles awake, it has to run into that cage. So there's this way like with ropes, and everybody pushes. But it all, I mean, they have that down to a science. Yeah, it's an incredible experience. And then to see that rhino then a few hundred kilometers further away at the end of that day being released somewhere, and then the next day seeing that it's already drinking and adapting. Yeah, then you really think, I mean, these guys are doing great work, and there is a new rhino population there, and people that live in that area, they are proud of having those rhino, because all that preparatory work needs to be done, right? You're not going to introduce rhino on somebody's land who's not. So people are anxiously awaiting that rhino, and they're really proud that the rhino is back. Yeah, it's great work.
It almost sounds like a Formula One car setup, right? Like, you know how
Yeah.
quickly they take off the
Yes,
cars out of the wheels and like
definitely.
re-put it on,
Yes, it
and
is
then
like
you're
that.
ready to go.
Yes.
It sounds like a an
Yes.
incredible thing to witness.
Yeah.
A question that we were having too from the community earlier was, when you do this horn removal process, does the
Yeah.
horn ever grow back, so that because if it's like fingernails, right, presumably it keeps
Yes.
growing. Do you have to go back in and re-dehorn? And then
Yes.
I guess the other question is, how does it affect their social behavior when you do this horn removal? Do we know if there is any negative effect in terms of mating, or even if there is, I guess it might just negate the fact that they're actually not being killed, right, by the
Yeah.
poachers?
Yeah, no, definitely good question. So yes, indeed, the rhino, the horn grows back, and so ideally you have to sort of redo that operation every 3 years, and then you have also the issue of securing the horn. So that's a whole other thing, and then you can do all this DNA stuff. There's this rhino database and all that. And the second question was, if it impacts, let's say, the behavior of that rhino. Um, um, it doesn't change, let's say, reproduction rates. It doesn't seem to change natural behavior. You would expect it does, because they don't have horns for nothing. I mean, they use it. Males use it in fights. They use it also to look, let's say, for food and stuff. But it doesn't really, impact, let's say, longevity or reproduction success. And I mean, the conservation benefits of this approach are so important. So that it's actually it's not harming the animal in any known way.
Nice. And is that for the black rhino, or I guess the white one, is it sex independent, meaning that both male and female
Yes.
are horned, and therefore you'd have to do regardless of who you're transporting? At what point for like a calf does one go and intercede and start this process? Because I imagine, right, you're having to, like you mentioned, there's 200 new calves in the area. Excellent. What point do you intercede and be like, okay, how can we protect these particular animals? And then a follow-up too is that we've read in the past that there were this pink paint that could be sometimes put onto the rhino horns to dissuade poachers from wanting to harvest it because it's like coated in this weird material. Is that an active process too, or is it just more efficient to just get rid of it?
Yeah, so the first question is, you need to, for dehorning to be effectively for poachers not to go in an area anymore, you need to dehorn almost every animal with a horn. And not all of them, but the chance for a poacher, like if there is still a chance for a poacher to find a rhino with a horn, they will go. So you need to have a significant part of that population dehorned, and horns grow quite at young calves as well. So it's really like maybe, I don't know, up to 1 year, 1.5 years or something. You don't do it. But older than that, you would dehorn if they are still also with their mother, like a 2.5 year calf. You would also dehorn.
And is there a use of this pink paint that we've read about? So there had been some introduction of like attempting to paint the horns to dissuade the poachers, so that maybe it might be a little bit less invasive of a process.
No, there was this initiatives to sort of to put some type of light radioactive material in horns, because horns are, well, first of all, you can detect them, those horns, whatever, with scanners. If airport or let's say customs authorities would use these type of technologies. And the second the idea was, since rhino horn is used for two purposes, and one of those two purposes sort of traditional medicine, for, let's say, fever treatments, so that people, if they would know that there is potential to swallow something radioactive, they would do it. I don't think that's really a common thing that people do. So no, people. It does happen that people put in, like, say, chips in horns. Also sometimes in law enforcement, so you let like one horn escape, so to see what the trafficking route is of horns. But no, I don't think that radioactive approach is really taken off.
Is there any way to synthesize rhino horn and just flood the market with that? Is that something that is being looked into as another way of?
Definitely, there is actors that are actively promoting, indeed, 3D printing of fake horn, and it actually is it's genetically, or it's just identical as the real thing. So yeah, their argument is you just flood the market with artificial horn. The end consumer won't see the difference, and if you do it for ornaments, it's still the same thing, and it's the same thing. There's many people that are not in favor of that approach, including, I think, to a large extent, our organization and myself. Is you don't know what the total market of. We all try to dry the market out. So we do all these demand reduction efforts in consuming countries to tell people, first of all, it's not really working as medicine, and actually, if you use it for an ornament, it's not really cool to have. And these approaches are working. You can see it now with, like, say, the prices of, for instance, elephant ivory are going down. And you have seen these kind of fluctuations over the years in different markets. Like in Europe and in the US, you had like billiard balls and all that stuff with, you had fur coats, and many of those things are just no go anymore. And that is now sort of catching on quite well in a couple of those consumer markets. So if you would then inundate the market, you would like confuse that storyline. But also we're very much afraid that you would have then two markets. You would have the thing, you have the artificial stuff, and then you have the real stuff. And we are very much afraid of that real stuff, sort of like the expensive stuff, if you really want to show off. And that market is potentially really big. It is totally out of control. So it's a sort of Pandora's box that you would open that you can't control. So yes, it is it's now less, but it is definitely a thing that was at one stage seen as the golden bullet, a silver bullet.
Yeah, it sounds like kind of the lab created diamonds versus the naturally found ones, and there's like, the
Yeah,
natural one you could bypass and you don't actually have to go
yeah,
into the environment or child labor or
yeah,
anything like that. But then there's still this like, well, I want a real one. And it
yeah,
makes total sense how you're saying if you're trying to get rid of the desire to make this normal and then you start flooding the market with it again, it's
yeah,
like, well, now it's okay again to have, and you'll undo all the
yeah,
work that you've done.
yeah,
So I really
yeah.
like the logic behind that.
Unless you would have very intelligent sort of like consumer sensitization campaigns, is like, hey, if you really want it, this is authorized, and that you would need to have legal frameworks, and then you need to have like countries without any corruption and proper law enforcement, and everybody follows the rules. It's just we don't live in a world like that. It's not going to work.
Boss, give us an example of a rhino conservation success story that you were part of, that you got to work, right? That you look back on, you're like, this is the thing something that I was involved in here, and I'm like really proud of this, and why it was such a big deal to get this to success story off the ground.
Um, Well, I must say that like I did a lot of like stuff myself when I was in Africa. Now I am more in a function where I support people that actually do the stuff. Um, so my job is now more to find resources and to provide sort of remote backstopping and making sure that people that are the best at doing what they need to do get the resources they need. So I'm not claiming any fame for doing something great on rhinos myself, but maybe helping some of those great people do stuff. So yeah, I already mentioned Namibia. Namibia is a country that I know well. We have a big office there, and they are like the best people on rhino conservation out there. Their black rhino population is still stable, even in the current circumstances of huge poaching pressure. They, like last year, they created one of the few, maybe only the second, dedicated wildlife crime courts in the world. So where there's only wildlife crime cases that are being treated, understanding that wildlife crime cases are always, like, say, uh, inundated by other types of crime that are considered more important, which allows also to have like prosecutors and judges really trained specifically on these issues. So that is a big thing I can be proud of, that wildlife crime court was created. And we're also now working on something really exciting. There is this sort of the last frontier of Namibia. It's a really big area, perfect black rhino habitat, where there could be, let's say, a carrying capacity of up to 500 animals in that area, where the initial steps have been made to establish a founding population there. And there is a very clear roadmap. All the conditions we just talked about have been united. So it's now just rolling out of that roadmap over the coming years and years. So if we would talk again maybe in 10 years, then who knows how many rhinos are there. I won't name the place because that's it's always sensitive with where rhinos are. But yeah, that is something I am definitely very, very excited about.
Do you find that there are perhaps new emerging technologies that are making your job easier or maybe more realistic to come into the fruition? Like, is there some kind of AI tool or genetic tool that is given to you, like as you're managing the system, that makes it easier for you from the start and being able to predict if something's going to be successful and leading to it? Or is it a lot of this much more still like how you were describing the original boots on the ground, interacting with people, like that's still the
Yeah.
primary thing, and all this extra stuff is a little bit more of a
Yeah,
distraction?
no, I think for the actual, let's say, management of things, it is actually working with people is remains the most important piece. Will always be, but yeah, you have, let's say, the different pieces of the job become more easy because of technology. I know, let's say, combating wildlife crime, just connecting the dots. Okay, you take a poacher's iPhone, it's a treasure trove of information. Um, Not only because of the phone numbers that are in that phone, but also the social media use of that person, and then this whole world opens up. And if you have a couple of those phones, also from the other side of the world, you start to really be able, um, not only manually but also with tools to sort of map how networks operate. And then also, yeah, in terms of, let's say, research, there's new tools like, I know, so many, but like environmental DNA is a really interesting one, um, to really have like a low impact, quick sort of overview of biodiversity in a particular place. Not only like in the water, but even in the surrounding land, because of just runoff of like when it comes into a river or like a whole watershed. You can like, hey, really? Do we have this species here? Um, so yeah, no, yeah, there is definitely technology evolves so quickly. Even let's say how rangers can monitor species. So now you have all these handheld tools. You can upload information really quickly to a central operations room, where then managers can see where rangers are, where scientists are, where animals move, where assets are. Yeah, no, technology is definitely a key part of improving the conditions for people to do their job.
If you don't mind, boss, I have a follow-up question kind of on the people side of things, right? Like we mentioned earlier that these conservation projects are not just about the animal, right? That you have to get the people on side. And like you just said, that's still one of the most important things of getting the actual
Yeah.
people on side. How do you go about doing that? And I know this is like a what a broad question, right? But we've talked about how important it is, like for you and me personally, like my favorite animal, right? I would love nothing more than to us not to worry about the rhino, but if you don't get people on side, it's not going to work. How does one start, and like what, pointing to the success stories, what was done to allow this to be successful? Like what is it about Namibia or South Africa with the local people that has made this a success story that could maybe be a roadmap for future success stories?
Yeah, so cases I mean, the advantage of a species like a rhino is that they are, apart from, let's say, the tropical forest rhinos like the Javan rhino, the Sumatran rhino, like the African rhinos, they are in general easily to find. They are in open areas, and so if you have them in an area which is apart from that rhino also for other species interesting, or there's a waterfall or something spectacular, you have like a really nice trump card for developing something that can generate funding. So yeah, tourism is definitely a potential for some of this species work, and you have to do it well. A success story is really those Namibian conservancies, where, yeah, again, the biggest black rhino population, free roaming without fences, is in an area which is not a protected area. It's managed by local communities on their land. They're intermingled with goats and sheep. It's on their land, and it's them that protect it. And they do it amongst others because people come to visit those rhino. So you have community members that are those rhino rangers, and they partner up with really high-end tourism enterprises. So you have all this type of different constructions like joint ventures. So you have like from your South African overlander to tourists that pay $3,000 per night that come to these communities, and yeah, that really generates funding for those communities, both in terms of, let's say, fees, direct employment, yeah, other things like handicraft and things like that. And if you do it right, it also is like, it provides them the pride of, it's like, hey, we are an independent country. Since independence, we assured that the rhino that were on our land have come back, and that's us. There's nobody else. Yeah, those are really the best success stories you can have. Yeah, and then you have also places where you really protect the place really well, and you just fence it off, and you put huge resources in it to make sure that nobody can come in. Those are success models as well, but they are different from that unique opportunity. Yeah, the unique example in Namibia where it's if you are an outsider try to poach in that area, I mean, it's all the locals that are behind this exercise. So people see you. People are not. It's very rare that a rhino gets poached in those communal areas. That's really an amazing story.
It's like the community's taking ownership that this is our animal, this is important to us, and we are going to protect it together. And I love that, again, like you're saying, it's not even, it doesn't need to be this protected land. It is
Yeah,
just the people care.
yeah,
And
they
it's
do.
like, that's a really, really inspiring tale. It's like, man, wouldn't it be great if we can get everyone to just think that? And like you were saying too, it's a flagship animal, but by making ecosystems protected or community buy-in, you're not just protecting that one rhino, because that one rhino's success is dependent on its ecosystem success. And so,
Yeah.
like, what other animals, by protecting the rhino or by folks getting behind protecting the rhino, do we also support and do we also help?
Well, in that particular case, which is sort of that Mars kind of, so that's it's not very, let's say, productive for huge numbers, but there you have desert adapted elephants. So you have lions. Um, so those are the most, let's say, iconic species. But then you also have a whole bunch of endemic plants. Yeah, and they have all the ungulates. Not in high densities, but yeah, um, yeah,
One of those, it's a big animal, big space, like you mentioned, solitary, needs particular areas. That's going to lead to spillover of saving things that also need the
yes,
support,
that's
which is, again, like the importance of having these flagship animals. And that's been a common theme of the interviews where, again, I think that when someone maybe sees the WWF or organizations as such, you see the panda logo and you're like, oh, I'm just helping this one fuzzy animal that's super cute, but really the whole it's been incredible to kind of peel back the curtain and hear it's not just about helping this one animal in this one instance. It's about supporting the people of that area, right? Balancing the economic effects and the conservation effects, getting folks on side. Like, boss, like you said, you're a man of many talents. You wear a lot of hats. Like, I
Well, I'm definitely not a specialist in anything, but yes,
one question we had from folks is that, and this is maybe kind of an off the wall question, but I think it's just a fun one to ask. Is that you worked on stopping poachers and gold miners and illegal hunters. What is the most dangerous scenario that you found yourself out when doing this kind of work, like exposing these international rings? Like, I imagine there have been some instances where you're like, "Oh, what have I come into?" Like, could you describe to us like how you won, how what that situation was, if you had one, how you got past it, and what keeps you motivated to keep, you know, going independent of things that could be scary like this?
um, well, since I'm not a ranger, so yeah, it is really the frontline people that encounter most of the risk. I think the most scary thing I ever had was like a completely drunk military. Um, so that military guy that was not even a big offense, but he had wild meat in his pickup truck, and we were sort of controlling. I was sort of with our team, just like seeing how things were going, and we were stopping each vehicle just to spot check vehicles. That guy was starting to point at AK-47 at me. Yeah, so that was really uncomfortable because you didn't really know what would happen because he was so drunk. But yeah, no. So like the scary stories are more for the frontline rangers. Really, they are the ones that carry that stress. And then yeah, for the people that go after the kingpins themselves, because it's those people that also have the resources then to defend themselves. So if they know that you are like an investigator that's on their trail, then those are also dangerous jobs, much more than people like me. Um, Even when I was in the field, I was more like a policy person, or I was steering teams. Yeah.
There's different kinds of conservation efforts, right, in different countries. And one example is the panda in China, right, where the country owns the animal. Are there any instances like this when it comes to rhino, elephant, gorilla conservation work that exist? And then if there is, how have you had to navigate about that very particular kind of conservation and or ownership?
Yeah, well, the panda story is quite unique indeed, with like I said, the panda diplomacy that China does. But yeah, well, look at if you go to Africa, you go like in a country, you have local currency. Almost all those local currencies have wildlife on it. So just that the proudness on the continent of the wildlife they have, something. Then let's say the black rhino, for instance, in Namibia again, since it's an endangered species, the black rhino is by definition state-owned animal. So if you are like, as you just mentioned, you give me that piece of land, you're Namibian, you give me a piece of land where I can have rhino, then the government in Namibia says, yes, you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to have some of my rhino. You're allowed to be a custodian of the black rhino. So you become part of what they call the Black Rhino Custodian Program. And you're not allowed to to do like tourism around it and make a lot of noise around it. You have black rhino because that's too dangerous for us black rhino. So you do it basically out of your good heart of wanting to protect Namibia's rhino. So it's another sort of Chinese model where the government really says these are government-owned assets. They are allowed to walk on your land, but they're from all of us. And there's very strict rules on what you're allowed to do with those animals and what you're not allowed to do, and all the type of data you have to provide to monitor those animals. But overall, I think it is more, let's say, that the pride of countries that they have those animals, that some of those wildlife populations are rebounding, more than the sort of the China model where you where it's the diplomacy and even a money making operation with having them outsourced in zoos like in DC and in all over the world.
So would it be, at least in theory, a little bit easier for two countries to work together, i.e., like I'm in Namibia, but the neighboring country has excess rhino, black rhino, because of
Yeah.
space, and I have land. Is that a little bit easier to work between the two
No,
countries?
that happens. That happens a lot with all types of wildlife. But even elephants and rhinos, like again black rhinos, they have been transported, translocated successfully from countries like South Africa to Malawi to Chad. So over 3,000 miles by big Russian Antonov military transport planes, all the way to the other side of the continent. So yes, no, they are definitely being moved around, as long as indeed basic conditions of this species belongs there, and part of, let's say, the overall sort of conservation approach is adhered to. Yes, they are freely moved around, and then for other species, they are just private landowners also move species. And there's also systems for that.
It's very cool that it's again like you're linking back the pride, right? The pridal element to the whole continent, really. And it's like almost you're moving together, try to save that source of the pride,
Mm.
right? Um, so I guess, boss, as we're rounding out, you mentioned that your role has kind of changed over the years, right? From the boots on the ground, going across 2 months of an exploration in one direction multiple times, to dealing with the drunk military guy, to the rhino release, and now it's like the support network that you're offering. So what your day to day look like now? Um, how do you provide the support for those folks that need support, right, to make these things happen? And how can someone at home who's very passionate and loves these animals help you make a difference?
Um, okay, yeah. Yeah, so my day-to-day job, basically sitting mostly behind a computer, is a lot of Zoom calls and things like that. But is try to make sure that good ideas come to fruition. So by connecting dots, connecting financial resources, technical experts, like you had a few of our colleagues online, somebody that works on particular issues, connecting them to the people in the countries that we are working. It is a very broad work. We have offices in like 100 countries. Sometimes an office has an issue, like somebody leaves and there's like a big gap in capacity, so you need to help like find the best. All these type of things. That's the sort of the thing that you then start to do when you work this kind of job that I'm now doing. So it's much less exciting than like working in the field. But yeah, that's again that's it. But yeah, in terms of what people can do themselves, well, first of all, keep on watching your show, because just being there, yeah, just like in your free time, just I don't know what everybody does when they're looking at you, but they're maybe drinking a beer or something, but they're listening to nice stories. Just the fascination for nature, that is something that you need to. Most of us working conservation, they learn that from their parents, or they have a story about with their dad or something. So that's where it starts. So doing in your own life already, your little thing. Just go out there and spread the vibe. Um, yeah, I think that's an important one. Just in your day-to-day things, don't buy your second vehicle if you don't need it. Don't eat red meat every day. All those basic things. And then, yeah, specifically for African wildlife conservation, well, I have a huge list of things that we need. I mean, yeah, a ranger needs binoculars, they need tents, they need fuel for their vehicles. I mean, yeah, a rhino relocation, there's helicopter time, and these kind of things. So yeah, there is all types of ways people can contribute, but definitely it starts with watching David Attenborough, National Geographic shows like yours, and you have children apparently too. So yeah, that's it.
We have two little ones, and the older one she's 3, and her favorite thing to do is to go to the zoo or the aquarium and to look at all the animals and just ask questions. She asks so many questions. She's 3 years old and asking all the questions by it. I'm like, all right, this is how we do it, right? That just that love of like nature,
Yeah.
like you're saying. For the inspirational story, boss, that you mentioned, like in the story sharing, I feel like that's what's been the biggest part of all these interviews is just to see the superheroes like yourself doing this. And each one of you, and I know you're going to say this to me too, is that no, there's this whole support team behind me, and I get that. But listen, you, right, with all your expertise, have made things happen and made a difference in the world, right? From going and doing the massive treks, right, the 2-month adventures, to doing these connections today, to ensuring there's funding, that there's boots on the ground, there's the resources. What is it, like, after all this time, that keeps you committed and passionate about this work? Has there been, can you point to an event or series of events that have, kept you have hope? Because there's a lot of events, I imagine, like poaching instances, sales of the horns, whether it be the ivory from the elephants or the rhino horn, that could really break someone and be like, you know what, I can't keep doing this. But what is it that keeps you inspired, motivated, and that light shining in your eyes as you've been chatting with us during this interview?
Well, there's a lot of people working in conservation. People should realize that there is a lot of people doing this. I mean, already in the US, I mean, people managing the national parks. So many people dedicated. They could find other jobs. It's probably better paid, but they do all types of great stuff. So, and people in conservation in general are people you want to drink a beer with. So just to be part of that community is just really nice. Because when you work during the day, the next thing you want to do when you want to drink a beer with those same people in the evening to continue to think about dreaming about how you can make things better. Just that is what keeps you going. And if you come up with a good idea with folks and it works, even though in general it is quite depressing, because the world is, I mean, all the statistics, it keeps on going down. You can still make, in many places, huge differences. And then on the African continent, you don't talk about square centimeters. You talk about huge areas, and where you still have the possibility to connect, let's say, the core protected areas via corridors in large landscapes, involving people that live in those areas. So there is still a lot to be gained, and yeah, so these opportunities are still there. And yeah, there is success stories. I mean, look at those rhino populations of 3 of the 5 species. There, those trends are positive. So yeah.
Boss, I want to thank you again for your time, expertise, insight today. I know we were scheduled for like 45 minutes and we've almost gone for 2 hours. I really, I really appreciate. The community in the chat were like, we could listen to this gentleman speak for another 4 hours. We've just been truly blinded by how wonderful this interview has been, and all of your time, your expertise. Like, I hope people will listen back to this interview and be like, wow, I want to be boss when I grow up. because again, like it's incredible work that you do, and just thank you so very much for everything that you've shared with us today. Is there any last bit of inspirational, funny, exciting, upcoming things, anything at all that you want to share with the folks? And again, if you ever want to come back on, you just shoot us a text message or an email, and we'll have you on right away. So no pressure, no pressure.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, nothing really comes to mind in terms of, let's say, one particular thing. But I know what I will be doing from time to time is just in the evenings. I'm going to learn those emojis and these things. And when people, I saw one of your shows, all these remarks. I'm like, I don't know what it means. I speak English, I can read it. I don't know what it's. You guys have this whole language that
It's
really
fun.
nice to be here.
There's all these like sub uses to emojis. There's like a black and white face that's all over Twitch, and it means something like you're being snarky about something, or that you're being sarcastic. And then there's like the hand clapping ones. There's love one. There's all so many different kinds of emojis that there are. There's a whole subtext to it. But it's all, honestly, it's just having fun, and it's like when you're part of a community that wants to learn, it's just you're just having a good time.
Well, thanks for what you're doing. It's great.
Thank you very much, boss, again, for your time, expertise, and we'd love to have you back whenever you want to share any success story or any call to action. Thank you again.
Well, looking forward to that, and thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Everyone, all backgrounds, all ages, all genders, and all walks of life deserve an education. Come be one of us.